Welcome to my channel, The World of Science Fiction. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. The air in correction facility Gehenna tasted of recycled oxygen and quiet desperation. It was a thin, metallic tang that clung to the back of the throat, a permanent reminder of the void that pressed in on all sides. Cale knew the taste better than any other. For 7 standard years, it had been the first thing he breathed in upon waking and the last thing he noted before succumbing to a shallow, restless sleep. He stood his post on the upper gantry of Containment Block Aurelia, his gaze sweeping over the rows of humming stasis fields below. Each glowing blue rectangle held a problem the consortium wanted to forget, a life deemed too inconvenient or too volatile for the civilized sectors. Cale had once been part of that civilization, a soldier carrying a pulse rifle in the neon-drenched streets of Meridian Prime, enforcing the will of the corporate state. He had believed in the mission then, or had at least believed in the steady pay and the promise of a pension. The expansion wars had burned that belief out of him, leaving behind a husk of duty and a deep, abiding weariness. Gehenna was his reward, a slow, sterile death of the soul on a rock that orbited a dying star. He was a warden in a tomb, and in many ways, a prisoner himself. His face, reflected faintly in the reinforced plasteel of the gantry rail, was a map of old conflicts. A thin scar cut through his left eyebrow, a souvenir from a skirmish on Cygnus X-1. His eyes, the color of faded slate, held a stillness that others often mistook for calm. It was not calm. It was emptiness. Below, the other guards on shift, younger men with cruel smirks and an unearned swagger, moved with restless energy. They were bored, and their boredom curdled into a casual brutality that Cale found tedious. He did his job. He maintained his equipment. He stayed out of their way. His contract had another 3 years on it. 3 more years of breathing manufactured air and watching men rot in energy cages. Then he would be free, though he had long forgotten what he might do with such freedom. The klaxon, a low, guttural sound that vibrated through the deck plates, announced the arrival of a new consignment. This was unusual. High-threat transfers were always scheduled, logged, and anticipated for weeks. Cale straightened from his lean, his hand resting instinctively on the stock of the rifle slung over his shoulder. Down on the main floor, the heavy blast doors to the receiving bay hissed open, bathing the dim block in a harsh, white light. Subcommander Thorne strode in, his silver and black uniform immaculate, his face set in its usual expression of smug superiority. Thorne was a man who had climbed the ranks through politics and backstabbing, a creature of the system Cale had come to despise. Behind him, a grav sled floated silently into the block, flanked by 4 guards in heavy shock armor. On the sled was a containment cell, larger than usual, its surface shimmering with a containment field of violent, crimson energy. Even from the gantry, Cale could feel the power radiating from it, a static charge that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. The younger guards gathered around, their laughter sharp and nervous. "What is it, Subcommander?" one of them asked, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. Thorne smirked, a predator enjoying the fear of the lesser beasts. "The last relic from Xylos. The brass are calling it a strategic asset. We're calling it our new pet." He gestured to the sled. "Bring it to the central dais." As the sled moved into position beneath Cale's gantry, he got his first clear look at the prisoner. It was not a man. It was something else entirely. Vaguely humanoid in shape, it was tall and impossibly slender, its form composed of a substance that seemed to shift and flow like liquid shadow. One moment it appeared solid and dark, the next it was translucent, laced with faint, silvery light. It had no discernible features, no face he could read, yet he felt a palpable aura of ancient intelligence and profound suffering radiating from it. The crimson field that held it seemed to cause it immense pain, its fluid form spasming and contracting with each pulse of energy. The consortium had captured something old, something that did not belong in a cage of light and steel. They had captured a ghost. The guards on the floor laughed, their mockery echoing off the cold walls. They called it the witch, the shadow, the Xylan ghost. They tossed insults at the featureless shape, emboldened by the crackling energy field that separated them from the unknown. Cale watched in silence, a familiar disgust coiling in his gut. He had seen this before on a dozen worlds. The arrogance of the conqueror, the casual cruelty toward the vanquished. He had been a part of it. He turned his gaze away, focusing on the monotonous sweep of the block sensor array. It was not his concern. His job was to stand his post, to observe, to remain detached. Hours passed. The novelty of the new prisoner wore off for the others, and the block settled back into its usual, tense quiet. Kale remained on the gantry, his watch nearing its end. Then, a flicker. The main lights of the block dimmed for a second, then returned, a sign of the station's ancient power core struggling under the strain of the new containment cell. Down below, the crimson field around the alien creature wavered violently. Its shape convulsed, a silent scream made manifest in its shimmering form. A low, harmonic whine filled the air, a sound of pure agony. The guards on the floor backed away, their laughter replaced by unease. But Thorn, observing from the command console, did nothing. He seemed to be enjoying the spectacle. Another power surge hit, stronger this time. The crimson field collapsed into a pinpoint and then exploded outward, throwing the nearest guards from their feet. The alien, the Ethel, as the Xylans had called their guardian, thrashed in its prison, the energy now arcing directly against its body. Kale saw the damage it was doing, the way its shadowy substance seemed to boil and fray at the edges. The containment protocol was failing catastrophically. The automated systems should have compensated, but they remained offline, likely overridden by Thorn for his own sadistic amusement. He looked at the manual override panel near his station. It was a relic, a failsafe from an older time, strictly forbidden for use by anyone below the rank of warden. Using it was a direct violation of a dozen consortium regulations. It meant termination of his contract, imprisonment, a long and unpleasant future in one of these cells himself. He thought of his 3 remaining years. He thought of the hollow promise of freedom. Then he looked down at the creature, writhing in silent torment, a being of unknown power and origin being tortured for sport. A flicker of something he thought long dead, a stubborn, illogical spark of decency, stirred within him. He did not think. He acted. In 3 swift strides, he was at the console. His fingers flew across the dusty keypad, inputting the emergency stabilization codes he had memorized out of sheer boredom years ago. The system beeped its acceptance. He slammed his palm down on the large, green activation stud. Down below, a secondary power conduit hummed to life. A wave of cool, blue energy washed over the crimson cell, stabilizing the field, smoothing its violent fluctuations into a steady, secure pulse. The harmonic whine of pain ceased. The alien's form stopped thrashing. It slowly coalesced, its shadowy substance regaining its integrity. For a long moment, it remained still. Then, its head, a featureless ovoid of darkness, tilted upward. It seemed to look directly at him, through the floor plates, through the plasteel, directly into him. Kale felt a connection, a brief, silent acknowledgement that was more profound than any words. It was a feeling of being seen, truly seen, for the first time in years. That moment was shattered by Thorn's enraged scream. "Guard, what have you done? You are in violation of direct orders." Alarms blared through the station, no longer a warning of a power failure, but a full-scale security alert. Red lights flashed, painting the block in the color of fresh blood. Kale knew what was coming. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. He straightened up from the console, his hand finding the cold, familiar grip of his pulse rifle. He had made his choice. The consequences were immediate and absolute. The piercing shriek of the security alarm was a death knell for his old life. Before the echoes of Thorn's fury had even faded, the heavy doors at either end of the gantry slammed shut, sealing him in. Red tactical lights pulsed rhythmically, casting long, dancing shadows that turned the familiar architecture of the block into something menacing and alien. Kale heard the magnetic locks of the rifle racks on the lower level click open. The guards, his former colleagues, were arming for a fight. For him. "Kale, surrender your weapon and submit for disciplinary action." Thorn's voice, amplified by the station's comm system, boomed through the space. It was laced with a triumphant rage. Kale had given him the perfect excuse. Kale did not reply. He moved away from the override panel, his back against the cold metal wall, his rifle held at a low ready. He scanned the gantry. There was no escape. He was on a narrow, exposed bridge of steel, 40 feet above a floor full of armed men who now saw him as a traitor. Below, he saw Thorn directing his squad, pointing up at him, his mouth forming words Cale couldn't hear but understood perfectly. Kill him if he resists. Then, something changed. A new sound entered the cacophony of the alarms, a low, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from the very center of the block. The containment cell holding the Ethel began to glow, its stabilized blue field now pulsing with an internal, silvery light. The creature within was uncoiling, its slender form rising to its full, intimidating height. It raised its long arms, and the shadowy substance of its hands flattened against the inside of the energy field. Cale felt a tremor run through the deck plates beneath his feet. The lights flickered again, not from a power surge, but from a power drain. The Ethel was drawing energy from the station, pulling it into itself. The blue containment field thinned, becoming as fragile as a soap bubble. Thorn, his attention momentarily diverted, shouted at the technicians on the floor. Reinforce the field. Now, it was too late. With a sound like shattering crystal that resonated deep in Cale's bones, the energy field exploded. Shards of incandescent light shot across the block, and the guards on the floor threw up their arms, crying out as they were thrown back. The Ethel was free. It stood on the central dais, a being of pure, silent power, its form now a swirling vortex of shadow and starlight. It paid no attention to the stunned guards on the floor. Its featureless head was tilted upward, its focus entirely on Cale. It recognized its savior. It recognized his peril. With a movement too fast for the human eye to properly track, it launched itself from the dais. It did not jump. It flowed, an arc of darkness that soared through the air and landed silently on the gantry, just a few feet from Cale. The metal did not even groan under its weight. It was a creature of immense power, yet it moved with an impossible grace. Cale instinctively raised his rifle, his training kicking in, but he held his fire. There was no hostility in its posture, only a strange, protective stillness. Down below, the chaos erupted into gunfire. Plasma bolts, brilliant streaks of green and blue, began to slam into the gantry around them. The Ethel reacted instantly. It raised one arm, and a wall of shimmering, black energy solidified in the air before them, absorbing the incoming fire with quiet hisses. Cale watched, stunned, as lethal energy dissipated harmlessly against the impossible shield. He was trapped on a bridge with an alien powerhouse, under fire from his own side. His life had just become infinitely more complicated. The Ethel turned its head toward him. Again, he felt that strange, nonverbal communication, a sense of urgency, a clear instruction. Move. He didn't know how he knew, but the imperative was undeniable. It pointed a long, slender finger toward the maintenance conduit at the far end of the gantry. An escape route. A desperate, insane gamble. Cover me, Cale yelled, not knowing if the creature could understand his words, but acting on the instinct that they were now, inexplicably, allies. He broke from his position, sprinting down the gantry as plasma fire sizzled past his head. The Ethel moved with him, a fluid shadow at his side, its shield of dark energy shifting to intercept the most immediate threats. The alliance was unspoken, forged in a moment of shared crisis. He was a disgraced guard, and it was an escaped specimen. Together, they were fugitives. He reached the conduit hatch and slammed his hand against the release panel. It was locked, of course. Override needed, he shouted, fumbling with the keypad. The Ethel simply placed its hand on the meter-thick steel door. The metal groaned, warped, and then tore apart like wet paper, the edges glowing with residual heat. Cale stared for a half-second at the raw, effortless display of power before diving through the opening into the darkness of the maintenance shaft beyond. The Ethel flowed in after him, and the darkness swallowed them both, leaving the chaos of containment block Aurelia behind. The maintenance shafts of Gehenna were a maze of pipes, cables, and narrow crawl spaces, a forgotten circulatory system that ran through the bones of the station. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and lubricant. Cale, moving on pure muscle memory, led the way, his helmet's integrated light cutting a narrow, dancing beam through the oppressive dark. Behind him, the Ethel moved in absolute silence, a deeper patch of blackness within the gloom. He could feel its presence, a cool spot in the air, a faint pressure against his senses. Distrust warred with a pragmatic need for survival. This creature had saved him, but he had no idea what it was or what it wanted. For now, their goals aligned: escape. They were being hunted. He could hear the distant clang of boots on metal, the filtered shouts of Thorn's pursuit teams echoing through the vents. Gehenna was not a large station. There were only so many places to hide. Kale's mind raced, sifting through schematics he had studied years ago. The primary shuttle bay was out of the question. It would be the first place Thorn locked down. But there was a secondary bay, a decommissioned hangar used for storing decommissioned or haulers and maintenance drones. It was a long shot. The shuttles were likely derelict, stripped for parts. But it was their only shot. As they navigated a treacherous junction, crossing a narrow beam over a chasm that dropped down into the station's main reactor core, a squad of guards appeared at the far end of the corridor. Their helmet lights pinned Kale in a blinding glare. "He's here. Open fire." Plasma bolts lit up the shaft. Kale dropped to one knee, returning fire with his rifle, the weapon bucking against his shoulder. His shots were precise, aimed to disable, not to kill, a relic of a code he still, foolishly, tried to follow. He tagged one guard in the shoulder, another in the leg, sending them sprawling. But there were too many. They were advancing, laying down a sheet of suppressive fire that chipped away at the metal beam he used for cover. He felt a cool touch on his shoulder. The Ethel moved past him, stepping out onto the beam, utterly exposed. It seemed to ignore the plasma bolts sizzling around it. It raised both of its arms, and the darkness around it seemed to deepen, to coalesce. The air grew cold. The guards faltered, their barrage slowing as they witnessed the impossible. The Ethel unleashed a wave of force, a silent, invisible concussion that traveled down the corridor. It wasn't an explosion, it was a pure, kinetic shove. The guards were lifted from their feet and hurled back down the corridor, their armor clattering against the walls as they collapsed in a heap, stunned but alive. The Ethel's form seemed to flicker for a moment, its edges becoming less defined, as if the effort had cost it something. Kale saw it then. For all its power, it was not invincible. It was vulnerable. He grabbed its arm. The substance of its limb felt cool and strangely solid, like polished stone. "This way," he said, his voice low and urgent. Quickly, they reached the decommissioned hangar. As he'd feared, it was a graveyard of machinery. Dust lay thick on everything, disturbed only by the tracks of maintenance drones. Most of the shuttles were skeletal frames, cannibalized for the station's active fleet. But in the far corner, under a dusty tarp, was a small, ugly vessel, a Scarab-class short-range hauler. It was little more than an engine with a cockpit attached, but its power cells still showed a faint charge on the external diagnostic panel. As Kale worked feverishly to bypass the cockpit lock, the hangar doors began to shudder. Thorn's teams were cutting their way through. "I need more time," he muttered, his fingers flying across the interface. The Ethel moved to the center of the hangar, placing itself between Kale and the doors. It stood its ground, a silent sentinel. The doors finally burst inward with a screech of tortured metal. Thorn stood there, flanked by his elite troopers, his face a mask of cold fury. "You cannot escape, Kale," Thorn said, his voice dangerously calm. "And you have allied yourself with a monster. A mistake you will not live long enough to regret." He gave a sharp command, and his troopers opened fire. This was not suppression. This was a kill order. A storm of plasma converged on the Ethel. Kale risked a glance back from the cockpit door, which had finally hissed open. He saw the Ethel absorb the first few bolts with its dark energy shield, but the sheer volume of fire was overwhelming. One bolt, fired from a heavy repeater, punched through. It struck the Ethel in the center of its torso. The creature did not cry out, but its form convulsed violently, and a flash of silvery light, like a shower of sparks, erupted from the wound. It stumbled back a step, its shadowy form flickering erratically. It had been injured. It had taken a hit that was meant for him. That act, that clear and deliberate sacrifice, erased the last of Kale's hesitation. This was no longer just about his own survival. He owed this creature a debt. He scrambled into the Scarab's cockpit, his hands slapping against the cold, dead controls. The pre-flight sequence was agonizingly slow. Power converters whined to life. Navigation systems flickered on. Outside, the Ethel was faltering, its shield weakening under the relentless assault. Just as the engines began to hum, the Ethel collapsed to one knee. Thorn and his men advanced, their weapons raised for the final volley. With a roar of protest from its ancient bearings, the Scarab's engines ignited. Cale slammed the throttle forward. The small ship leaped from the deck, its landing struts screaming as they retracted. He angled the ship directly at Thorn's squad, using the bulk of the vessel as a shield for the Ethel. The troopers scattered, diving for cover. He brought the ship to a hover beside the wounded alien. "Get in," he yelled, popping the side hatch. The Ethel flowed into the ship, collapsing onto the deck of the small cargo bay. Cale didn't wait. He spun the ship around and fired the main thrusters, blasting through the weakened hangar doors and out into the blackness of space. Behind them, the asteroid prison of Gehenna dwindled, a pockmarked sphere of rock and tyranny. Ahead of them lay the void, and the uncertain fate of two fugitives in a stolen, dying ship. The Scarab was failing. Alarms chimed a mournful chorus in the cramped cockpit as Cale wrestled with the controls. The flight from Gehenna had cost them nearly all of their fuel and had pushed the ship's antiquated systems to their breaking point. Below them, the surface of a nameless moon sprawled out, a vista of gray dust and jagged craters under the cold, distant light of its parent gas giant. It was their only option. He brought the ship down hard, a controlled crash that sent a plume of gray dust billowing into the thin atmosphere. The landing gear buckled, and the ship skidded to a halt at the bottom of a wide, shallow crater, its engines falling silent with a final, shuddering sigh. The silence that followed was absolute, a profound emptiness that was more deafening than the alarms had been. They were alive. They were stranded. Cale unstrapped himself and went into the small cargo hold. The Ethel lay on the deck, its form less cohesive than before, the wound from the plasma bolt a shimmering, unstable patch in its torso. It seemed diminished, its inner light flickering weakly. He knelt beside it, his medical kit in hand, though he had no idea what he could possibly do. How did one treat a wound on a creature made of living shadow? He reached out hesitantly, his gloved hand hovering over the wound. He felt a wave of cold emanating from it. The Ethel did not move, but he sensed its awareness, its silent suffering. Acting on instinct, he bypassed his medkit's useless injectors and synthesizers and grabbed a nutrient paste pack, a bland, protein-rich gel that was standard survival rations. He squeezed a small amount onto his glove and offered it. The creature's head tilted. An appendage, like a tendril of smoke, extended from its body and touched the paste. It absorbed the gel, drawing it into its form. There was a faint pulse of something that felt like gratitude. It was a small thing, a pathetic offering against such a grievous injury, but it was all he had. For the next few hours, he sat with it, offering what little sustenance he could, a silent vigil in the belly of their broken ship. The moon was a brutal environment. The days were scorched by unfiltered radiation, and the nights were a lethal, cryogenic cold. Their journey was a shared ordeal. Cale, using the Scarab's surviving long-range sensors, had located a potential signal source, a derelict communications relay, perched on a mountain ridge nearly 100 kilometers away. It was their only hope of sending a distress signal, or at least of finding out where they were. They traveled by night to avoid the radiation. Cale wore a heavy thermal suit, but the cold still found its way in, a gnawing ache in his bones. The Ethel seemed less affected by the temperature, but its movements were slow, labored. It was still weak. They relied on each other. He navigated, using his knowledge of terrain and survival to find the safest paths through the treacherous, crater-pocked landscape. The Ethel, in turn, used its abilities to scout ahead, its shadowy form melting into the darkness to identify dangers, unstable cliffs, deep fissures hidden in shadow. Their communication evolved beyond simple gestures. He began to understand the subtle shifts in its form, the faint pulses of light within its body. A slow, steady glow meant calm. A rapid, silvery flicker meant danger. A deep, violet hue meant it was in pain. He learned to read it like he would a weather pattern, a language of light and shadow. In return, he felt it learning him, sensing his moods, his fatigue, his resolve. One night, they were caught in a sudden meteor dust storm. The sky, once clear and filled with alien constellations, became a roiling cloud of razor-sharp particles. There was no time to find shelter. Cale threw himself behind a rock outcropping as the storm hit, the dust scouring his suit, the impacts like 1,000 tiny needles. He looked over and saw the Ethel standing its ground, its form wavering in the gale. It raised its arms and created a small, localized shield of dark energy, a pocket of calm in the heart of the storm. It then moved, positioning the shield to protect not just itself, but him as well. He huddled behind the creature of shadow, sheltered from the storm by its power, and understood the depth of the bond that was forming between them. They were no longer just allies of convenience. They were partners. They finally reached the relay station, a skeletal tower of rust and broken antennae clinging to the mountainside like the skeleton of some long-dead beast. Inside the main control room, most of the equipment was dead, shattered by time and micrometeorites. But one terminal flickered with a faint, residual power. It was not enough to send a signal, but it might be enough to access the local data logs. As Cale tried to interface with the ancient console, the Ethel approached. It placed its hand on the machine. The terminal, which had been flickering weakly, flared to life, its screen filling with streams of data moving too fast for Cale to read. The Ethel was not just powering the machine, it was communicating with it. Then, it turned and placed its other hand on Cale's helmet. His world exploded. It was not a sound or a light, but a flood of pure information, of feeling and memory, poured directly into his mind. He saw Xylos, not as the conquered rock the Consortium had reported, but as a world of breathtaking, alien beauty. He saw cities of living crystal, forests of glowing flora, and skies filled with creatures of light. He saw the Ethel's people, beings like it, who were not individuals but part of a single, vast planetary consciousness. They were not warriors. They were gardeners, caretakers of a living world. He saw the arrival of the Consortium. He saw Administrator Forlag, the architect of the Xylan campaign, a man whose ambition was a cancer. He learned the truth. The Consortium had not come for resources. They had detected the planetary consciousness and saw it as the ultimate power source, a biological computer of infinite capacity. Their plan was not just conquest. It was vivisection on a planetary scale. They wanted to shatter the world, capture the consciousness, and enslave it. The Ethel was not just a guardian. It was a failsafe, a key that could either protect the consciousness or, if captured, be used to unlock it. The war on Xylos had not been a war. It had been an extermination, a slaughter of the innocent to get to the prize. The vision ended. Cale stumbled back, gasping, his mind reeling from the sheer weight of the revelation. The disgust he had felt for the Consortium now hardened into a cold, focused hatred. He was no longer just a fugitive running for his life. He was a witness to a monstrous crime, and he was allied with the last survivor. He looked at the Ethel, no longer seeing a strange alien, but seeing the last remnant of a murdered world, a silent keeper of a sacred trust. Later, as they rested in the shelter of the relay station, the first rays of the distant sun cresting the mountains, he tended to the Ethel's wound again. It was healing, the unstable patch slowly knitting itself back together. As he worked, the Ethel reached out and gently touched the long, jagged scar on his forearm, the one he had gotten on Cygnus X-1, the wound that had ended his career as a frontline soldier. As its cool fingers brushed against his skin, he felt a flicker of its own memories, its own pain. He felt the loss of its people, a sorrow so vast it was like an ocean. He felt its loneliness, its fear, and its unbending resolve. In that moment, their scars, one of flesh and one of shadow, became a point of connection, a shared history of pain and survival. The bond between them was now sealed, not in words, but in a mutual understanding of loss. They were both the last of their kind. He, a soldier who had lost his faith, and it, a guardian who had lost its world. And together, they had found a new purpose. They would not just survive. They would fight back. The truth had given Cale a cause, but it had also painted a target on their backs that spanned the entire sector. Forlag would not allow the last key to his prize to remain free. As if on cue, the relay station's proximity sensors, unexpectedly jolted to life by the Ethel's touch, began to scream a warning. A fleet had just translated from hyperspace into the system's outer orbit. A consortium fleet. Cale's blood ran cold. He zoomed the external sensors, his knuckles white on the console. The ship designations were stark and terrifying. Leading the fleet was the flagship Indomitus, Forlag's personal command vessel. And escorting it were destroyers from the 7th Fleet, the same unit that had prosecuted the Xylan campaign. They were led by a familiar vessel, the strike cruiser Harbinger, Thorn's ship. They had been found. "They're here," Cale said, his voice a low rasp. "They're hunting us." The Ethel stood beside him, its form radiating a calm, cold fury. It projected a feeling into his mind, an image of the fleet, and then an image of a single, massive ship being brought into position behind the moon. It was a vessel Cale recognized from classified military briefings, a thing of nightmare legend. A Planet Cracker-class siege vessel, the World Breaker. It was a ship designed for a single purpose, to shatter planets with a focused gravimetric beam, allowing mining operations to harvest the core. But Cale now knew its true, horrific purpose here. Forlag was not going to risk another ground campaign. He was going to fracture Xylos and scoop its planetary consciousness out of the rubble. There was no running. There was no hiding. Their tiny, broken-down moon was nothing more than a temporary inconvenience for a force of this magnitude. A direct confrontation was not just suicidal. It was laughably impossible. They watched on the long-range display as the World Breaker began its warm-up sequence, its massive energy core causing visible distortions in space-time around it. As a demonstration of its power, it fired a low-intensity beam at one of the system's other, smaller moons. The celestial body, a rock 1,000 kilometers in diameter, simply vanished in a silent, blossoming cloud of vaporized rock and superheated gas. The message was clear. This was the power they were facing. The war was unwinnable. Despair, cold and heavy, settled over Cale. They had survived Gehenna. They had crossed a dead world together. They had forged a bond, all for nothing. They were about to be erased, footnotes in Forlag's monstrous ascent to power. He turned away from the screen, unable to watch. He looked at the Ethel. It was not looking at the screen. It was looking at him. It raised its hand and once more placed it on his helmet. This time, the vision it shared was not of the past, but of a possible future. It showed him the heart chamber on Xylos again, the central nexus of the planetary consciousness. It showed him a ritual, an ancient failsafe designed for just this kind of existential threat. The consciousness could be shielded, made permanently inaccessible, hidden from the galaxy behind a psychic wall so absolute that it would be as if it never existed. It would be saved. But the ritual required a sacrifice. The wall, the seal, needed a lock. And that lock had to be a sentient mind, a willing anchor to hold the barrier in place for eternity. The Ethel showed him a figure, a humanoid shape, placing its hand on the central crystal. It showed the figure dissolving into light, its body breaking down as its consciousness expanded to become the warden, the eternal guardian of the seal. The process was irreversible. It was not death, but it was the end of self. The individual would be gone, subsumed into a greater, silent purpose. The Ethel could not be the lock. It was the key, the conduit for the ritual itself. It needed a partner. It needed him. The vision faded, leaving Cale standing in the cold, dim light of the control room, the weight of an impossible choice pressing down on him. The Ethel did not pressure him. It simply showed him the path, the only path that did not end in the utter annihilation of its world and the enslavement of its soul. It was offering him a way to win a war that could not be fought. The price was everything he was. His life, what was it worth? A handful of bitter memories, a contract he no longer served, a future he had no plans for. He was a ghost long before he had met the Ethel, a man haunted by the wars he had fought for the very monsters he now opposed. He thought of his empty existence on Gehenna, the slow decay of his spirit. He thought of the casual cruelty of Thorn, the rapacious evil of Forlag. What was his individuality worth, measured against the soul of a world? He walked out of the relay station onto a narrow ledge overlooking the vast, cratered expanse of the moon. The gas giant hung in the black sky above, a swirling marble of silent, cosmic beauty. He looked at his hands, the calluses on his palms, the scar on his arm. These things were him. His body, his memories, his name. Kale. To give them up was a terror beyond the simple fear of death. It was the fear of oblivion, of becoming nothing. But then he thought of the Ethel. He thought of it shielding him from plasma fire, taking a wound meant for him. He thought of it sheltering him from the storm. He thought of the trust it had placed in him, the last hope of a dying race. He had started this journey with a small, inexplicable act of compassion. Now he was being asked to finish it with an act of ultimate sacrifice. He spent what felt like a lifetime on that ledge, wrestling with the man he had been and the choice he now faced. He was a soldier. He had been trained to fight, to kill, to survive at all costs. But the Ethel had shown him something more. It had reawakened that spark he thought had been extinguished on Cygnus X-1. The spark that chose to stabilize a failing containment field not because of orders, but because it was the right thing to do. His decision, when it came, was not a thunderclap of revelation. It was a quiet, solemn acceptance. A sense of peace settled over him, a clarity he had not felt in years. He was no hero. He was no savior. He was just a man who had been given a chance to make his empty life mean something at the very end. He walked back into the control room. The Ethel was waiting, its form still and patient. It knew what he had decided. He didn't need to speak. He looked at the creature of shadow and starlight, his partner, his friend, and he gave a single, slow nod. The Ethel raised its hand and gently touched his forehead. He did not receive a vision this time, but a feeling, a wave of profound, heartbreaking gratitude, mixed with an equal measure of sorrow. It was the sorrow of a friend saying goodbye. They both knew what had to be done. The only question now was how. On the tactical display, the consortium fleet was beginning to move, their destination clear, Xylos. They had to get there first. Their plan was an act of supreme desperation. The Scarab was dead, its engines cold, its hull breached. But the communications relay, boosted by the Ethel's energy, was picking up more than just the consortium fleet. It was detecting the faint, intermittent transponder signal of a derelict ship in a decaying orbit around the moon. It was an old consortium patrol cutter, the Stray Dog, likely a casualty of some forgotten border skirmish years ago. It was a wreck, but it might have a functioning drive, a working cockpit. It was their only way off this rock. They journeyed to the crash site, a treacherous climb up the moon's northern polar region where the cutter had gouged a long, deep scar in the ice fields. The ship was a skeleton, its hull peeled back in places, exposing the mangled corridors within. But its core systems were shielded, and as Kale cut his way through a jammed airlock, the emergency lights flickered on, casting the interior in a ghostly green glow. The life support was dead, the corridors were a vacuum, but the fusion core still held a charge. It took them hours of frantic work. Kale, his suit's oxygen running low, bypassed fried circuits and rerouted power from non-essential systems to the engines and navigation. The Ethel, its form able to withstand the vacuum, moved through the ship's broken exterior, physically sealing hull breaches with a hardened, resin-like substance it could excrete, patching their vessel together with its own body. They worked in a silent, efficient partnership, each anticipating the other's needs, their shared purpose a powerful, unspoken bond. Finally, with a groaning shudder that ran through the entire vessel, the cutter's engines ignited. They had a ship. Kale strapped himself into the pilot's seat, the controls cold and unfamiliar under his gloves. The Ethel stood behind him in the small cockpit, a silent co-pilot. He looked at the NAV computer. A direct course to Xylos was a suicide run. They would be detected and vaporized long before they reached the planet. But he had an idea. He plotted a course not for Xylos, but for the system's asteroid belt, a dense, chaotic field of rock and ice. They'll expect us to run, Kale said, thinking aloud. They won't expect us to attack. He angled the cutter toward the main fleet, pushing the patched-together engines to their limit. On the tactical screen, he saw their tiny ship appear as an unidentified contact. Immediately, 2 destroyer-class escorts broke from the main formation to intercept. It was Thorne's vanguard. Hold on, Kale warned. He led the destroyers on a chase into the densest part of the asteroid field. He was a good pilot, but Thorne's men were better equipped, their ships faster and more agile. They closed the distance, their forward cannons beginning to spit bolts of plasma. Kale weaved the cutter through the spinning rocks, using the asteroids as cover, the impacts of near misses shaking the ship to its core. Just as the enemy destroyers had him cornered, their firing solutions locked, the Ethel acted. It placed its hands on the cockpit's viewport. Outside, a dozen massive asteroids, some the size of a city block, suddenly changed course. Their spin slowed, and then they began to move, converging on the destroyers with an unnatural, guided velocity. The Ethel was not just a creature of shadow. It had a fine, powerful control over gravity. The consortium pilots cried out in confusion and panic over the open comm channels Kale was monitoring. Their ships, designed for space combat, were not equipped to handle a targeted avalanche of rock and ice. One destroyer was crushed instantly, its shields and hull collapsing under the immense kinetic force. The other swerved desperately, only to be sheared in half by a fast-moving shard of iron-rich rock. The gambit had worked. They were through the screen. Kale pushed the cutter's engines to maximum, breaking from the asteroid field and making a final, desperate burn for Xylos. The planet now loomed large in the viewport, a world of swirling, opalescent clouds, besieged by the dark, menacing shapes of Forlag's fleet. The World Breaker was in high orbit, its main weapon glowing with terrifying energy as it prepared to fire. There was no more time for stealth. The cutter screamed through the upper atmosphere of Xylos, alarms blaring as the hull heated to a dangerous degree. Below them, the living crystal cities of the planet seemed to cry out in a symphony of light, sensing their doom. Kale saw their destination, a vast, mountain-like crystal formation that pulsed with a soft, internal light, the heart chamber. As they approached, a single, sleek fighter detached from the Indomitus and dove after them. It was Thorn's personal interceptor, a ship that outclassed their stolen cutter in every conceivable way. "He's coming for us himself," Kale gritted out. Thorn's voice, filled with cold, personal venom, crackled over the comm. "Nowhere left to run, Kale. I will enjoy watching this world die, with you on it." Laser fire stitched across their hull. The cutter bucked, one of its engines exploding. They were spiraling, losing altitude fast. Kale fought the controls, aiming their plummeting ship toward the entrance of the heart chamber. "It's going to be a rough landing," he said. The ship crashed through the crystalline outer wall of the chamber, skidding across the luminous floor before slamming into a pillar of solid light. The impact was violent. Kale was thrown against his restraints, his head striking the console. For a moment, his vision swam in a sea of black spots. He unstrapped himself, his body aching, and stumbled out of the ruined cockpit into the vast chamber. The air hummed with a gentle, melodic energy. In the center of the cavern stood a colossal, floating crystal, the heart of the world, pulsing in time with a slow, deep rhythm. This was the place. The Ethel flowed out of the wreckage, seemingly unharmed. But they were not alone. Thorn's interceptor landed gracefully near the opening they had created. The canopy hissed open, and Thorn leaped out, flanked by a squad of his elite soldiers in black carapaced armor. "It ends here, traitor," Thorn snarled, raising his plasma rifle. The Ethel moved to stand between Kale and the soldiers. Its form began to change, its shadowy substance expanding, its inner light flaring into a brilliant, terrifying corona. It was no longer hiding its power. It unleashed its full fury, becoming a whirlwind of dark energy and kinetic force. It met the charge of Thorn's soldiers not as a victim, but as an avenging angel. Kale knew this was his only chance. While the Ethel bought him time, he ran toward the central crystal. The air grew thick around it, heavy with a power that made his teeth ache. The low hum of the chamber rose in pitch, a choir of cosmic voices calling him home. He could feel the planet's consciousness, a being of unimaginable age and wisdom, aware of his presence, aware of his intent. It was waiting for him. He reached the dais at the base of the crystal. He turned for one last look. The Ethel was a storm of destruction, its slender form a blur as it dismantled Thorn's squad with terrifying efficiency. But Thorn himself was pressing forward, his weapon firing relentlessly, forcing the Ethel back. It was holding him off, but it could not hold him forever. Above, through the shattered ceiling, Kale could see the World Breaker's beam beginning to form, a lance of pure annihilation aimed at the heart of the planet. There were no more choices to be made. Kale took a deep breath, the last breath of the man he had been, and placed his palm flat against the smooth, warm surface of the crystal. Pain and light were the only two things in the universe. An agony beyond comprehension tore through him as the crystal accepted his offering. His body felt like it was being unraveled, thread by thread, atom by atom. His skin, his bones, his blood, they dissolved into a torrent of pure energy that flowed into the crystal. His scream was silent, lost in the roar of the planet's awakening soul. His consciousness, however, did not die. It expanded. In an instant, his mind stretched from the confines of his skull to encompass the entire world. He felt the roots of the glowing forests, the currents of the crystalline seas, the thoughts of every living thing on the planet, all harmonizing into a single, majestic song. He felt the Ethel's grief and its fierce, unwavering loyalty, a single, pure note in the grand symphony. His personal memories, the face of his mother, the feel of rain on his skin, the name Kale, became distant echoes, fading into the vastness of his new being. His last human sensation was sight. He saw the heart chamber from 1,000 different perspectives at once. He saw Thorn, his face a mask of enraged disbelief as he finally blasted his way past the Ethel. He saw the Worldbreaker's beam striking the upper atmosphere. He saw the Ethel turn, its featureless face looking toward the crystal, a silent farewell. Then he acted. As the Guardian, the Warden, the Lock, he sealed the gate. A wave of pure psychic energy, not of destruction but of absolute negation, erupted from Xylos. It was a silent, invisible wave that expanded at the speed of light. Thorn, his rifle raised to execute the Ethel, simply stopped, his weapon falling from his lifeless hands as his mind was wiped clean, leaving an empty, breathing shell. The Worldbreaker's beam, inches from striking the planet's surface, dissipated into harmless radiation. Across the entire consortium fleet, every system went dead. Engines, weapons, life support, all of it was silenced. The minds of the crew, from Administrator Forlag on his throne to the lowest-ranking ensign, were touched by the profound, irrefutable command of the new Guardian. Leave. Forget. The prize they sought was gone, erased from reality itself. The war was over, not with a bang, but with a deep and final silence. The fleet, crippled and mindless, began to drift, its purpose forgotten, its invasion ended. Kale was gone, but the Warden remained. 10 years had passed. The sector, once dominated by the iron fist of the consortium, was a different place. The catastrophic failure of the Xylan campaign, the unexplained loss of the 7th Fleet, and the catatonic state of Administrator Forlag had shattered the corporate state's power. It had crumbled from within, its rapacious ambition finally choking on a prize it could not digest. In its place, a fragile alliance of independent worlds had begun to flourish, built on cooperation rather than conquest. Xylos was a beacon in this new era. The world, once scarred and on the verge of annihilation, had healed. Its living crystal cities glowed brighter than ever. Its glowing forests had reclaimed the battlefields, and the skies were once again filled with creatures of light. It was a world at peace, a quiet sanctuary protected by a silent, unseen guardian. It was known as the Silent World, a planet that no ship could approach, not because of a physical barrier, but because any mind that held hostile intent would simply forget its purpose and turn away. In the heart of the planet, within the vast, crystalline heart chamber, the Ethel stood before the great central crystal. It came here often, a pilgrimage to the nexus of its world's soul and the memorial to the man who had saved it. The crystal no longer pulsed with a volatile, raw energy. Instead, it emitted a soft, steady, calming light, the color of a peaceful dawn. The light was Kale. He was the Warden. He was the seal. His consciousness was the silent, eternal guardian at the gate. The Ethel reached out a slender, shadowy hand and pressed it gently against the crystal's surface. It did not speak, for it had no voice. It did not think in words, for its mind was part of the greater whole. But it remembered. It sent a flicker of memory, a focused thought, into the infinite consciousness of the Warden. It sent the image of a sterile containment block on a desolate asteroid prison. It sent the feeling of a crimson energy field tearing at its form. It sent the memory of a single, defiant act, a guard at a forbidden console, choosing compassion over protocol. It sent the image of a barren, gray moon, of a shared ordeal under a sky of cold, distant stars. It sent the feeling of a hand touching a scar, a moment of shared understanding between two broken survivors. For a fleeting instant, a flicker within the crystal's depths responded. A wave of something ancient and vast, yet intimately familiar, washed over the Ethel. It was not a memory of a man named Kale, for that man was gone. It was a feeling of peace, a feeling of purpose found, a feeling of gratitude for a friend who had not been forgotten. The sacrifice had been absolute, but it had not been an ending. It had been a transformation. The jaded soldier, the man who had lost his way, had become the foundation of a lasting, silent peace. His legacy was not a statue in a plaza or a name in a history file. It was the quiet, enduring light of a world saved, a somber and beautiful monument to the warden at the heart of it all.